I'll start off with giving you the history of my mom and dad and where they came from and how they eventually ended up here in Victoria. My mother, she was born in Chicago, Illinois. It was the two girls, and when she was 2, her father died, and I really never knew how he died, but I was going through some old letters that were my mother's, and I guess he was riding a horse, reading the newspaper, and he hit the clothesline, and it flipped him off and killed him. So after that happened, their mother moved them up to Ontario to her brother's place. And I remember my mother talking about riding in the cutters in the snow and pouring maple syrup on the snow to harden it. And she grew up there until I think she was about 14. And then her mother remarried and we moved to Penhold, Alberta. And I've got a couple of pictures here of my mother in Penhold, and she's riding a horse, and then she's dealing with her pesky sister. When they were living at Penhold, they used to come out here to Victoria for the winters, and they moved and lived all over Victoria over the years, as far out as Otter Point. They got, I can name about 15 places in 15 years that they lived here in Victoria in the winters, and it's always in a different place. So whether they paid the rent while they were here, I don't know. But so then eventually my mother moved out here for good, and I've got more pictures here. She got a job working for the Hudson Bay Company as a clerk, and I've got a picture of them here with the staff at the Hudson Bay Company. And I also noticed that this was done by Gibson's, which was the old school pictures. So that would have been probably in 1920. I don't know how long Gibson's had been in business. My mother was 42 when she got married, and she'd never been married before. So she spent a lot of time with girlfriends and stuff. And I've got all these pictures of her. Here's that's the Hudson Bay picnic on Saanich Inlet. Here's some more pictures in 1916 of my mother on Capra Bay Beach with a bunch of soldiers. You know, they used to do a lot of traveling. My mother did all over the place. They were down in Bellingham and Campbell River, and she had a driver's license. But my dad never did. He never drove. And the reason for that was that he spent years in the merchant marine, and he was never on shore long enough to learn how to drive, I guess. She spent a lot of time when she got older with the Women's Institute here in Victoria. And I'll start with my dad now. He came from Crittenden in Kent, England. In 1907, he came to Canada. And I got a picture here of his first job in Canada. And he was working on the Transcontinental Railroad in Vermilion, Ontario. And then after that, he moved to Winnipeg. And he brought his oldest sister out from England, and as well as his dad. And his oldest brother and his family, they all went to Winnipeg. Then in 1916, he joined the Navy, and he was stationed in Halifax on December the 6th in 1917 on a ship called the Niobe. And that was the day that the Mont Blanc caught on fire, and they had the Halifax explosion. My dad was in the engine room on the ship, and the other guys down there heard about the ship on fire in the harbor, so they went up to take a look at it. And he was doing something. He figured he'd finish it, and then he'd go up. Well, he got halfway up when it blew up, and it knocked him from one end of the corridor to the other. So the guys that went up first were all killed. So, and the next day, and for the next week after that, they gave them, the crew, these big baskets, and they had to go around and pick up body parts and try and piece them together. So then, with being in the Navy, he eventually came around to Esquimalt through the Panama Canal. And it didn't take him long once he was here to realize that there's a better place than Winnipeg to live in Canada. So he sent for his brothers and sisters, and they all moved out here to Victoria. All one did move to Vancouver. And my aunt, I always knew her as Aunt Annie, and she was Mrs. Bryant, and they bought a 5 acres on the corner of Miller Avenue and Wilkinson Road. And I spent a lot of time there when I was a kid growing up, and we used to play cards in the wintertime, and she had a big garden. I used to have to look after this garden. And then one day she made an arrangement for me to meet Peter Gardner, who was her next door neighbor, and he was going to take me fishing. And we went down, the Cultus Creek ran right through her property. So we were down there, and we kept getting this, or Peter kept getting this bite from this trout, and he couldn't catch it. So he went home and he got bigger hooks. He came back, and he hooked two that day, and he got that big trout, and he hooked me. And I was fished for the next 15 years in the Cultus Creek from Beaver Lake right down to Carey Road. Pulled a lot of trout out of that creek over the years. Then my uncle, Albert Bryant, he died in 1944, and he had an old 1928 Chev that he used to drive, but after he died, my mother used to drive it. And something that he had on his property that he had this collection of Indian arrowheads. There was probably 10 to 12 of them, and he found them all on the property there around the creek, and also in the field that they used to plant and hay in summertime. So I don't know if there was something special happened there with the Indians, or because that seems to be an awful lot of arrowheads to find in one 5-acre plot. So anyway, every Saturday we used to get in the old 28 Chev and we'd go into Victoria to do shopping, and then we always stopped at the Royal Dairy on Hugh Street for an ice cream, and then we'd come back on home. And another time we were in the old 28 Chev and we were going down West Saanich Road in the summertime, and there was a cock pheasant flew right into the window. So everybody's yelling, roll the windows up, because dinner had just arrived. When I was at home there, and when I was growing up, I can remember listening to the radio and listening to The Shadow and The Green Hornet and Dick Tracy, and every Sunday, we always used to, in the winter, we'd start the fireplace up and make popcorn and sit around and eat oranges. And quite often, my dad would be looking out the window and a car would pull up outside and he'd say, "Damn it, here's the enemy," which were friends of my mother's from Benhold, Alberta. And, but he was always nice to them when they came in the house. So. Well, I can remember the war years, because the Army used to come up Wilkinson Road to go to Heels Range, and I can remember the brain gun carriers and also the motorcycle brigade, and I was terrified of the noise they used to make, and I'd run and hide behind the house. I can remember that like yesterday. And we used to end up having to eat in the hallways with all the doors closed for the blackouts, and I can remember the ration books, and I can remember all the maps in the paper, because I used to, where the Allies were in Europe, and I would color these maps in crayons. Oh, that, something else that I remember, and I guess it was a big deal, they found a bunch of Japanese writing on the rocks up on Mount Douglas. They were directions on where Naden was, so in case the Japanese got here, they could have gone and bombed Naden. And in the fall, we always used to come up here to the Royal Oak Cemetery to pick mushrooms. It was a great place for picking mushrooms. In fact, I think my oldest daughter now, she still comes here, but she gets blackberries, wild blackberries. And then I went the first day of school at Royal Oak. I go back a little bit here. My dad, once he got here, he left the Navy, and he joined a ship called the Canadian Winter, and it was built here in Victoria, and he was on the maiden voyage, and it was going to Australia and New Zealand. And I've got all these postcards and stuff of his where he's been all over the world. You can pass them around. So I guess my mother, they were living on Wilkinson Road. What I know now it was a Corker's house, which was right next door to where we ended up building on Wilkinson. And she was living there, and my dad, between trips, he'd come and stay at the Bryants down on Miller Avenue, so that's how they met. And they were married in 1936 in that church in the corner of Wilkinson and Glen Road. When I first started school, they had a soccer team there. There were two soccer teams, and one was the Ford and one was the Chevs. And everybody wanted to be on the Ford team. But of course, my mother drove the Chev, so I had to be on the Chev team, and I don't think we ever won a game. And then when I was 7 years old, they put me on the ferry to Seattle, and I had to go up to the Greyhound bus depot and get the bus to go to Sacramento, California, where my mother's sister lived. And that was probably one of the more memorable trips of my life, but not in a good way. My dad always used to say that things like that built character, but in my case, it built fear and anxiety. My aunt, when I got there, she was just appalled that they let me go down there by myself at 7 years old. So they brought me home. In grade 5, I was on the soccer team, and we were playing Prospect Lake, and all the boys had steel toe caps on their boots. And I was in goal, and I got kicked in the leg, and I got a broken leg over it, and then the school board banned the steel toe caps. Then I ended up joining the Boy Scouts, and I was Peter Goddard's dad, was the scoutmaster, and he knew I spent a lot of time fishing in the Culpers Creek, and so he got me a job working for Dr. Parazoo, and I was collecting crayfish, snakes, and newts and fleas off the dog. I used to get a nickel for crayfish, 10 cents for snakes, 10 cents for newts, and 1 cent for fleas. I should have got 10 cents for fleas, because I know suckers are hard to catch. And we lived right next door to Enid's mom and dad, and I remember they had cattle or cows, and they used to have this big cream separator. And anytime you go down there, it was always a big thick skin of cream, and you could get your fingers in there and sample it, and then you'd get yelled at. I would imagine they got more than yelled at. And then there's the famous Mrs. Welch. Yeah, I had my fair share of the strap, and I remember one time two of us got sent up for the strap, and there was nobody in the office, So we took the strap out of the drawer, because we just happened to know where it was. And there was an old leather football there with the laces in it. So we unlaced the football and stuffed the strap in there, and she came in, she tore the place apart, and we didn't find it. And there was always a rattle in that football after that. And I think once when we went to Mount Newton, which was a survival of the fittest as far as I was concerned, everybody wanted off school, that sucker. And then when I finally, Grant Gilray got me a job working for this contractor on the weekends. And I did that for 2 years, I guess. And I think you got fired because you were asking to get paid.
As I remember.
Yeah, and so I went there one day with Derek Gay, and he had this old Plymouth coupe, and for some reason there was no work for us that day. So I remember we put together 86 cents and we put it in the gas tank. And we went over to the eastbound road, and there was a guy who stripped the foundation on his house. So we offered to clean all the nails out of it for $10, and he said, go ahead on it. So we did. And he said he really liked the way we worked. And he said he didn't have any more work because he contracted the rest of the house out. But he said he had some friends that were contractors, and he gave them a call. So I started with this Chinese outfit called C&Q Builders, and Grant eventually ended up working for them. And then when I was 16 in the summers, I went to work for the BC Forestry in Haney, a place called Mike Lake, and we were building horse trails, and we re-decked 2 bridges. And then the following year, I spent with them again, but this time on Mount Seymour, and we were clearing ski trails, and we resurfaced the gravel road that summer. And I ended up going back with Keith Cameron. He came out here for about 4 years, and then he went back to Manitoba, and I used to go back to visit him once I got my driver's license. And him and I have been back and forth there 2 or 3 times. Also, when I lived at home, Cowie, the tree surgeon, used to dump all the branches from their tree surgeon business in the old rock quarry across from our house. And we used to go over there and build forts in them, and also with our supply of wood for the fireplace. And then when I first left school, I went to Campbell River, and I worked on a new road up Elk Valley when they were building the Strathcona Dam, and then came back and I started my apprenticeship carpentry with a company called Howland Wilson. And after a couple of years, they did the solarium job, and they did it too low, so they ended up going broke. And I was between jobs, and I was thinking about forgetting about the apprenticeship and going up north. And I was coming out of Eaton's through those over-revolving doors onto Douglas Street, and Mrs. Welch was coming in, and she saw me, and she chased me around out onto Douglas Street and wanted to know what I was doing, and I told her I was thinking about going up north and quitting my apprenticeship. Well, she went up one side of me and down the other about quitting and sticking with it and on, and I felt like Mr. Bobblehead. Oh, yeah, right, yeah. So 2 weeks later, I started with farmer construction and finished my apprenticeship with them. And then I left and went to New Zealand, and I was down there for 6 months. And we'd been up to, I worked down there on a pulp mill addition. And then myself and 4 Aussies, we had an old pickup truck, and we were sleeping under bridges and in barns and whatever. And we'd been up to Auckland, and we were been to the Grand Prix, and we were headed down south. We were going down the South Island. We're on the ferry between the 2 islands, And they were going to have a race down on the South Island, and they were loading all these race cars from the dock down into the hole on the ferry. And I'm standing on the deck watching them do this, and I saw this guy go by with a big cowboy hat on, and I figured, gee, he looks familiar. And then another kid behind him, and it turned out it was Phil Crampton and Mike Davies. So we got them to join us. So we bummed around down, and we were down at South Island. At that time when I was there, you could have quit 10 jobs a day. There was just so much work. And we were down at South Island. We ran out of money, and I remember we went to this cookie factory. And, you know, the guy there said, well, he needed somebody, but he said, I want you guys just come in here to get a big feed of cookies and then head back on the ferry. No, this is a career change for us. Here's what we're going to do. 1 week later, we're full of cookies and we're back on the ferry to the North Island. So then I went to Australia and I hitchhiked from Sydney over to Perth. And that was a bit of a shocker. The flies and the snakes and the heat, and nobody picked you up. I'd spend hours sitting out there on the highway. Then I took a cruise ship and went from there to Italy, and I went and visited Dan Cuthbert in Germany and Lynn Sheldrake in England, and Lynn and his wife took me over to Ireland, and then I flew from Ireland back to London and from London to Toronto. And while I'd been away, my parents had sold my car, so I got them to send the money to Toronto, and I bought another car and drove across Canada. And then right back to farming construction, and I stayed there until after I got married. I figured I didn't want to spend 25 years paying for a mortgage, so I left Farmer and we went up to Gold River, and we bought a mobile home and we were living in that. Then we moved to Campbell River eventually, and then from there down to Jordan River. And once the kids started the school, we built a house out in North Saanich. And that's basically, when I was 18, when I first came back from Campbell River off that first job, I bought my first lot. It was $850 for 3/4 of an acre in Cadova Bay on Fowler Road. And luckily I had that, because when I came back from working at Jordan River, we sold that and managed to basically pay for the house that we built. When I was a kid growing up, my dad always used to book a week's holiday at an auto court, and it was either Basin Bay, or sometimes Mill Bay, or sometimes Salt Air. And that picture there is in Salt Air. That was my first salmon that I caught. I was 8 years old. And it was 7 pounds, 8 ounces, I think. Here's a picture of the house that I lived in Wilkinson. My dad built that. My dad, when he was away on those trips around the world, when he came back, he would go to the Saanich tax sale, and because it was during the dirty 30s, he ended up with quite a few lots around Saanich, and about 1944, it was just after the war, and he was going to build a rental house on one of these pieces of property, but he couldn't get nails. And I remember we used to have to go down to Ogden Point, and we'd get the nails out of the crates, and then bring them home, and then we'd spend hours straightening all these nails to give to the contractor that we had building this house. And then eventually he built another house, and the tenants in both those houses were there for over 20 years. And that's basically, I never knew my dad was to work. He retired before I was born. He was 52 when I was born, and my mother was 42. we've pretty much covered the whole scenario here, I think.
Thanks very much, Lloyd. And would you answer questions if anybody has any?
Yeah, no problem.
Thank you, Lynn.
Starting with me, you have 5 children, as you know?
No, I got three children, and I got 9 grandchildren, but 2 came with the package, and I call them the 2 imposters.
Where do they live? In the church?
Vern lives in Sioux, and my oldest daughter lives here in Saanich, and my youngest daughter lives in New Westminster. Yeah, my oldest daughter right now, she's up in Mount Washington, and I should be here. Any other questions?
I have a cheeky question for you.
Oh, okay.
You gave us the weight of the fish. What were the birth weights of your 3 children?
Same weight as the fish. Don't even ask their birthdays.
You know their names?
Barely.
My dad always called them Pakistan.
I did have an interesting experience fishing there. There was 3 of us, and there's a creek that cuts off of Colquitt's, runs along Quick's Pond and across Markham Road and through the old Mental Home property up into urban, and from there it's just like a ditch along into urban, but the trout would go up there to spawn. And we'd gone up as far as into urban, and we hadn't caught anything, so we laid the fishing rods down beside the road and the ditch, and we had a friend, Jim Quayle, up on Viaduct, so we went up to visit him. When we came back, we had 3 Rhode Island red chickens on the worms. So I think that was the day I learned why the chicken crossed the road. Because there was a great hoo-ha with the owner of these chickens. He wanted to pay us to pay for them. Well, of course, we didn't have any money, and he kind of explained to him that his chickens weren't supposed to be out of his yard. So, but he had to kill them to get photos. Yeah.
Do you know any of the history about the old quarry?
No, I don't. No.
I always wondered what they were taking out of there.
Just rock from the road.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, what about the campfires we used to have in there?
Oh, yeah. Well, we used to throw 22 shells in the campfires. When Gibson's lived next door, we used to put 303 shells in the vise and hit them with a ball-peen hammer. That was always exciting. Yeah, 'cause I remember the cows coming up Wilkinson Road from the Upshur farm down on Ferry Road, which is where the Northridge subdivision is now.
I mean, your mother always seemed delighted that you were bringing home girls in numbers.
Grant and I used to go to Sunday school together, and in the summertime, the collection plate used to sit up on the altar upside down, and we'd fill it full of grasshoppers. And then we shut the organ off one time, and that created a bit of a hubbub. I took this picture 2 weeks ago, and it screams Royal Oak to me.
Sheila Morgan and I played in the quarry many a time. But you were told not to ever go there, but we always find it. It's great.
Yeah, it gets soaking wet.
You know, didn't we stop and have a small conversation?
Oh,
Pretty wet. We remember happy memories of going to Sunday school. Mrs. Godson, Reverend Godson was the
Yeah.
here at Mrs. Godson, and we were saying, oh, baby, Then we'd all trip back to Lewis's house, and his mom, this would be Sheila, Grace, and I, Maureen didn't have anything to do with us, but the three of us would trip back there, and your mom always baked cookies with sugar.
Yeah.
Yeah, and she did a tray of cookies, of course, and then you would get that Sunday paper, how much should we'd all lay on the floor and
Yeah.
read the paper and munch on cookies, and we just loved it.
Right.
Always remember that.